Good to go?
Yeah.
Good to go.
Cool. Well, welcome everyone to our Tech for Good talk on behaviour change. Thanks for joining us. Just as a quick kind of overview of what we're going to be talking about today, we are going to do some quick intros, who we are, and then we're going to be doing a bit of scene setting, talking about the topic that we're all here to talk about today. So a bit about behaviour change. And then really excited that we're being joined by some of our colleagues in our user experience team who are going to be talking a bit about change for good. And then we're going to be diving into our panel. Again, we have Professor Mark Maslin and Rosie Isbell here. So we're going to be doing some introductions and diving into some conversation with them around their experience with behaviour change too. Just as a bit of a reminder, we will be taking questions as normal. So please do pop them in the chat as we go through. We will leave some time at the end. If we have a chance to feed them in as we go through, we will. But don't worry, we will definitely leave some time at the end to get round to your questions. So a bit about who we are. So I'm Gabby, and I'm the head of commercial here at 3-Sided Cube.
And I'm Rich, and I'm the managing director here at 3-Sided Cube. And 3-Sided Cube, who are we? We are a software development agency, but we're very mission-led. And our stated mission is that we want to change millions of people's lives for the better.
Yeah, so lofty challenge, and how we do that is by building tech for good. We do that because technology is a super powerful tool that has the potential for huge reach and impact, but the technology itself is agnostic. So the technology doesn't care if it's used for good or for bad. So we choose to work with clients that are aligned with our mission, that have the expertise, the audience, the knowledge, and the reach to develop solutions that can make a real positive change in people's lives.
And so when we're making that kind of change and we're trying to have that kind of impact, a lot of the work we're doing with the apps that we provide is around behaviour change and altering people's behaviour in the way they interact for themselves and with the world around them. And we've got quite a bit of heritage doing that. So we've worked on our emergency apps. That's all about getting people prepared in times of emergency, which is a big shift that you have to try to encourage people to do, because generally speaking, people don't worry about these things until they're in the middle of it. So it's quite hard work to get people who are not in the middle of a hurricane to worry about a hurricane happening. We've worked stuff like that, or our blood donor app, where we're trying to create habitual donation of blood and plasma, and there's a whole load of interesting techniques around that as well. Perhaps a really interesting area though that we've worked on probably over the last kind of 12 months and has sort of culminated with a new project that we're working on at the moment with a client of ours called Hero, is all around the behaviour change in sustainability. So it's a really, really interesting area, because the problem with climate change is that you don't get the usual kind of cause and reaction kind of feedback that you do get in other apps. So by me washing up my yogurt pots before I recycle them, I don't instantly see the ice cap stop melting. It doesn't quite work like that. So it's a very, very kind of complex problem to solve. And it brings with it a whole raft of different issues around the kind of the sort of more standard behaviour change techniques that you would use. So what we're going to talk, the guys are going to talk about now is Greg and James, who worked on the Hero project, are going to look at some of the sort of key drivers for behaviour change that there is out there in the world of apps and software.
Hello folks, so we've been mulling over this question and debating internally how we can make sure to close this gap, and we're going to take you through a little bit of like the behind the scenes thinking that we've done on this and some of our other apps. So the first thing is to address exactly that gap that we're talking about. You know, people agree that they could or want to do more to help the environment, but when it comes to seeing how people actually do, there's definitely a gap there between the intention they have and the actions that they take. So, how do we make sure that people like fill in that gap and actually do take the action? So one of the first things that we're looking at is like, make sure that people are appropriately motivated, emotive messaging to get people bought into making that change.
So a great example of a product that's done this really well that I've experienced is a product called Shame Plane. So the name of it sounds pretty harsh, but it's a really simple and impactful concept. You essentially input the flights that you've taken, and it communicates it in a really clear, insightful way, like what impact those flights have had. Unfortunately, this product isn't live anymore, but yeah, it just illustrated my impact really starkly and clearly. And I think the key thing that it brings up is that one flight, even a really small short haul flight, can wipe out the impact that you've had through all the lifestyle changes that you've done over the course of a year. This really motivated me to sort of see that flights were the key thing that I could do to change my lifestyle and have a more positive impact. So it actually has completely persuaded me to stop flying and offset all the flights I'd done in the past few years. So yeah, I think this is an example of something that's been surprisingly impactful and motivational. So motivation is one aspect of how we can help behavior change with design. But another key aspect is making action easier for people. So for me, in this space of sustainability, this is all about offering smart suggestions of actions that are achievable for different individuals based on their own circumstances. Unfortunately, at the moment, a lot of the actions that get suggested to us through various products are at best a little bit irrelevant to our lifestyle, and at worst they can be kind of like wildly unachievable due to personal circumstances, and this can be quite alienating to the whole sustainability cause. So personalization of these actions, I think, is key, and Greg's got a really good example of a product that's done this.
So Nike Plus Run Club is like a really interesting example of how this kind of personalization is done really well. You start with quite a default workout, but basically every future workout is changed depending on your performance. So ensuring that every future goal or like kind of goal that you have to achieve is personalized depending on your performance. So if you start slacking off a little bit, it will make the next workout a little bit easier. If you're doing really well, it will make the workout harder, so that you're always kind of at that sweet spot. And I think we could see something quite similar working for sustainability, helping people make slow, gradual changes that are tailored to both their habits and the areas that they're comfortable changing. So James was talking about, people have different habits. Some people might be more comfortable cutting flying out than cutting meat and dairy out, whereas other people would much rather cut meat and dairy than cycling to work every day. So, the ideal solution there to close that intention action gap is to leverage what we know about people's preferences and make those smart suggestions based on their circumstances. So you've motivated people, you've made it easy to do. The next aspect is building habits out of those. So, there's a lot that could be done here as well in terms of like creating long-term change, which is what we really need.
So this example kind of concerns the concept of budgeting and the mental model around that. So I think with sustainability, we do need to start thinking about the fact that we do have a finite amount that we can safely emit and a finite amount of resources. And we're good at finding ways of working in similar constraints in other spaces. And the mental model of budgeting money is one that's really helpful and is quite in tune with how a lot of the science is often being communicated successfully with the public. We have this concept of a safe carbon budget. So that being that we all have an individual amount of carbon that we can sort of safely emit for our behaviors, and that that can be sustained at scale. And I think, Greg, you've used this app and found that it had a good impact on your long-term behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is YNAB. You need a budget. The philosophy around it is that all the money that you have available, you allocate specific categories like rent, groceries, takeaways, eating in. And the idea is that, once you've spent money in that category, you have to make an active decision to remove money from another category and, to fund that category. So, nope, I've had all the takeaways I've budgeted for this month could easily become, nope, I can't fly to Mallorca again this year. I've used all my carbon budget for flying. So, being educated about the carbon cost of our actions, I think, is a key part of making sure that, we see long lasting behavior change, making a conscious effort of like, okay, I'm not doing this thing so that I can do this other thing that costs me a lot of carbon. So we've covered now kind of the motivation, ease of use, and also like building out habits. The other thing that we think is really important to consider is ethics. So we have to acknowledge that a lot of the stuff that we've looked at, the tactics and techniques here, are quite powerful and, unfortunately addicting as well. So even though the idea is that we're using these for good, that we want to kind of use these behavior change tactics for sustainability, we still need to make sure that we're taking care of users and the people that can make those changes, to ensure that, they carry on using the products, they think that it's like fair. And we use a rule internally of how we judge those things.
So this rule is the change that you're asking a user to make, one that they came to your product with an existing intention to make in their own lives. This is the kind of question that qualifies whether a behavior change that you're asking somebody to do is actually ethical. So this is called the regret test by the author of the awesome book Hooked on behavior change by the author Nir Ayal. So yeah, this is something that we should always ask before creating behavior change products. And following the change you're asking a user to do is one that they really originally did come to you for. You kind of have the license to use some powerful nudging tactics, and that can be a really positive thing, making the product something that is kind of like an encouraging coach that's kind of nudging you towards achieving your goal. So I think this rule holds up in general as a way to judge a lot of the ethics around behavior change products, but there are some nuances with it. So there's a bit of a blurry line when you consider that people's intentions over time do kind of fundamentally change, but they might also have a momentary blip. So it's kind of judging whether it's one or the other. So a personal experience that kind of illustrates this. So I had to deprioritize my sort of behavior change of adopting the learning of Japanese through Duolingo to focus on kind of getting ready to be a parent. It just wasn't a big priority for me anymore. So I ditched my Duolingo habit and my morning lesson. And sort of months after I'd done that, I keep getting these messages from this sad owl that's like emotionally blackmailing me to come back and use Duolingo. And I think it kind of misses the mark and misjudges it a little bit. My personal intent has kind of moved on, and that's sort of my choice. And as opposed to like maybe dipping into Duolingo and going back there at some point, I'm really put off it. And there's a concept in like UX of this thing called reactance. So this is when a user feels too pushed by a product or too constrained by certain choices, and it kind of threatens their autonomy, and they want to just push back in a kind of big reaction and abandon that product to kind of reclaim some of their own personal agency. So yeah, I've ditched Duolingo, but this guy's kind of gone one further, and his is like making a proactive effort to troll Duo the owl, logging back in to kind of make him sad. So yeah, I think this point just kind of illustrates, I think we always need to assume that people's intent of why they're kind of coming to you and the behaviors that they want to change can change over time. And if you don't take heed of that and acknowledge it in the product, you can really put them off doing the right thing. And yeah, if we show ethical consideration to our users, it actually does help us long-term to change behaviors. So yeah, that kind of wraps up a few of our thoughts on the tactics of behavior change in products.
Nice.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for sharing a bit about your process and those really key areas for us. That's really, really interesting. Have you made any owls sad recently? Like...
Well, as a keen French speaker, as you
oh
know,
my goodness,
I do. Yeah, I often.
If
have
anybody
a sad
wants to
owl.
ask any of the questions in French and really confuse Rich, feel free.
Just never stop.
I think what's really interesting as well is looking at, it's always really important when you're looking at any area to look at obviously cross-sector to see how other areas are doing really well and how you can sort of take some of the metaphors and some of the you know, the ways that work really well in those different industries across sector. It's always a really important thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And some really key points that we can think about. So thank you so much for that. If you have questions for James and Greg, they will be sticking around. So please do pop them in the chat. And as I said at the beginning, we will be getting round to questions at the end. And also, without further ado, we've got some more experts for you. Aren't you all lucky? So again, please do ask questions throughout and we can ask our panel of experts those questions. So thank you so much for joining us, Mark and Rosie. Without further ado, I'm going to dive straight in and get you introducing yourself. So Rosie, do you want to kick us off and tell us a bit about yourself and your areas of expertise?
Hi, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. I'm a freelance design director and I specialise in the intersection of experience strategy and design craft with people right at the centre. And I've had experience working with numerous fantastic brands all over the world. And I spent some time in San Francisco and Munich. And yeah, I'm really excited by this topic. So thanks for having me here today.
Wow, thank you so much. Very excited to be talking to you about all those wonderful design elements as well. So thank you for joining us. And Mark, would you mind introducing yourself as well, please?
Certainly. Thank you for having me. So I'm a professor of Earth Systems Science. So I look at climate change in the past, the present, and the future. And I've been very fortunate to work with really innovative sort of like companies. Some of them are billion-dollar companies and some of them are startup, to basically take them on that journey to sustainability. So I was really interested in how you're actually interacting with people, because of course it's a journey that you suddenly don't turn up as a green guru or suddenly the most sustainable company in the world. It's a journey, and it's about educating people and taking them with you. So I'm very happy to be on this panel.
Amazing, and a really interesting point already around that journey. And I suppose that kind of leads me into the first question, which I would like to kind of kick off and get your thoughts on, is really like, in that journey, how do you keep ethics at the heart of behavior change? You know, James and Greg talked us through some of those key areas, and I suppose it'd be interesting to hear your experience around really how you keep ethics at the heart, because it sounds like quite a moral maze. Mark, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So I can take this at perhaps a larger level. So what's really interesting is why a lot of companies and organizations are taking climate change and sustainability really seriously is because they've realized that the new generation, the young generation of bright young minds that want to come and work for them, actually want to work for ethical and moral companies. And so they're actually looking at this. And so therefore there's this sort of like balancing act which companies realize that they've got to be ethical and they've got to have this moral compass to actually attract all that young talent in. And then once they're in, then they are actually driving behavior change within the company. And again, it is really important to balance that ethical nature, because it is very easy to try to dictate to people what they can do. And I think we need to keep that freedom and openness for people to actually make the right choice.
It's really interesting. And from a design perspective, Rosie, is that similar? Is there differences?
Yeah, I would echo what Mark was saying there about the moral compass. It's really important for a brand or an organization to kind of really know where they stand when it comes to this, and make sure that they've kind of got that positioned, because it's something that, you know, the outside world is going to see, and it's going to be reflected. It should be reflected in the products and services that the end consumers, people like us, are going to be using. So as a designer goes through that process, it's important that the brand, the organization, the design team are weighing everything up against those, and making sure that they're kind of really sticking to that. And I think that particularly, you know, in the work that I do in terms of design research, that plays a huge part when it comes to actually the kind of practice of design research. And I think that designers do have a really incredible opportunity, you know, to tackle and look at how the products and services that they create can have a positive impact on the world around us.
It's amazing. It's really interesting, and I think really important when you're trying to drive for that big change. Certainly something that I think we saw come across quite heavily in what James and Greg are doing, and I know is part of what our team do. So it's really interesting to hear kind of that cross sector. In terms of sustainability, you know, Mark, hearing about what you were talking about in the introduction, you know, what you focus on and what your specialty is very much linked to some of those topics that we were talking about earlier on with the projects we've worked on, and obviously what James and Greg have been working on with Hero. In terms of behavior change theory, you know, how can it be used, I suppose, to close the sustainability intention action gap, which Greg and James talked about at the start? Do you have thoughts around that you can maybe expand on a bit for us?
Yes, I mean, I think their introduction was very, very good. I have to say I would probably order it the other way just because I am lazy, which is, I think one of the most important things is ease. Making life easier for people. I mean, I think this is something that people forget, particularly, and I have to say this quietly, in the ivory towers of academia. They sort of forget that normal people like us have really busy, complicated lives. You know, getting your kids to school on time, doing their homework, trying to make sure they have 5 a week, let alone 5 a day, you know, all of that. And on top of that, then I come along and go, hey, guess what? I want you to help save the planet. So that's really, really difficult, because as they showed, everybody really wants to do positive things. It's just they don't have the time or effort. So I think a lot of it is about ease. There's a brilliant story from Finland. So Finland have now made it that everybody has to go on a green energy tariff. Okay, electric and gas, etc. However, you can opt out of it, and there might be a small saving if you go for sort of a non-green tariff. Guess what? Most people don't. Again, and so it's that classic switching everything round to actually help people do the right thing. So for example, in the future, banning petrol cars. Oh, we have to buy an electric one. I'm going to buy the right one for my family. Oh, and then suddenly it becomes normality. And I think that's the other thing we need to do, is change becomes new normal, because we're very adaptable. I mean, look at all the changes around us. You know, I pick up one of these, you know, sort of like almost everybody, including my parents, can actually use a mobile phone, which 20 years ago, nobody would have realized that everything you can do on a phone. So I think having a perception of a new normal, which is better than the old normal, I think that also helps.
And do you think, because that's true, that the change you described there from Finland, or a classic one in the UK is banning plastic bags, and you suddenly had to start buying plastic bags, which has had a mixed success. If you look under my sink, I've got about 4 million plastic bags, which I need to recycle desperately, because I always forget to take them to the shop anyway. But yeah, that's a sort of regulatory thing that was quite top down. And then have you seen that affect product design you know, that you guys have been involved in when you're looking at trying to change consumer behaviour, that ease of use piece, has that affected the way you do your product consultancy stuff?
I think Rosie's probably a better one.
Yeah,
sorry, I was aiming that way.
Definitely, Rosie.
I mean, I can start off by saying one of the biggest issues is actually trying to get people to think slightly longer term. So the shift from fast fashion to slow fashion, you know, the idea that quality not speed and things like that. So I think we need some mindset changes, but I'm sure Rosie will have some much better ideas than me.
I mean, I think when it comes to James and Greg did a great kind of explanation of, you know, how you could close this gap. But, you know, I think you could also, like when you're looking at behavior change, something I'm really passionate about is design research. We know that, you know, at the start of the new year, everyone makes a New Year's resolution, they will to do something. But I think studies show that you know, before it even gets to the end of the month, they've already changed their mind. Most people have dropped it and moved on. But people do want to make positive change, and we can actually use design research to understand how we can kind of close that gap. And that's a really powerful tool, because actually then you're getting the real kind of insights and able to understand what are the barriers, what are the pain points that are stopping people from actually doing these things that we're talking about. And through that kind of design research process, like we're empowered with those insights, which help us kind of understand how we can, as James and Greg were saying, motivate people towards those specific goals, and actually then design products and services that are actually helping to kind of close that gap. So there's a number of, I guess, different, you know, behavioural science techniques that we could employ that, I guess, James and Greg, you were talking about a minute ago, you know, like with the Nike Run Club app, I think it's a fantastic example of using not only kind of gamification of achievements, but also that kind of social proof. So you're being motivated by, if you know, enable the leaderboard, you're actually seeing how other people are moving towards that goal. And we see that on all sorts of kind of apps and product, you know, from like Strava. They also have a run club that motivates people by that kind of social proof. So I see it kind of, when it's in terms of developing products and services, it's a kind of combination of design research and these kind of techniques that we can build into the products and services themselves.
And that peer pressure thing, I think, is really important. It's something we need to build in. So, for example, why does somebody buy a car, and what car? It's because of what they want to be perceived and seen as. Why do we recycle? I'm not convinced that people recycle because deep down they go, I'm doing this to save the planet. No, they're doing it because they know the neighbors are watching. Okay, you mentioned beautifully plastic bags. The reason why, I mean, financially, 5p, 10p is nothing in terms of your shopping. So therefore, it's just a sort of like peer pressure reminder, i.e. we all feel guilty, which is, I've forgotten a bag, I'm going to take the plastic bag, everybody's looking at me. And so again, that sort of peer pressure can be good, plastic bags, recycling, but bad, I want a really large car, can't name any of them, but Porsche perhaps, which basically has a 8-litre turbo diesel engine, you know. But so we need somehow to actually move it all one way.
Yeah.
Interestingly, that came up. We did some around the sustainability world. We did some research with consumers and brands and businesses, and from a brand point of view, peer pressure between brands was seen as a major driver for them to behave in a more sustainable way. So it kind of works at that more macro level as well. I suppose we're all suckers for it.
Yeah, and I suppose, like, in terms of, I hate to mention it because I think it gets mentioned at most webinars, but actually, you know, Rosie, you talked about that design research process and the importance of it. You know, how has the pandemic actually impacted that? Is there more of a driver for that, or is there less of an urgency around that and less of importance around that?
I mean, I think it's maybe made it more accessible, and I think, you know, some of the kind of techniques that we might be doing in fields, we obviously those haven't all been possible in the way that we would normally do them. You know, like observations or shop alongs or some kind of co-creation sessions. They've obviously not been possible to do in person. It's meant that people have had to employ and use different types of tools and think creatively about how to design perhaps, design tasks within the research session. But alongside some of those practical challenges of, Wi-Fi and making sure that everything, is running properly, you're also losing that kind of like real life intersection. So the kind of sights, the sounds, some of the behavior that you might observe. But there's actually, different approaches that you kind of could take by, for example, looking at diary study. And, there are actually some benefits to doing remote research. You can be in multiple time zones in one day. You can, conduct more research. It makes it a bit more efficient. And actually some people are more comfortable. So there's definitely pros and cons, but I think it's still beneficial, even in a remote context, to bring in a real user's perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's super interesting. And I suppose just before we move on to maybe some examples of technology that you've seen being really effective, just one last question that kind of I thought would be quite interesting for both of you actually is, like, how do you ensure that whether it's organizations or even academia or just general consumers, that there's this real, you're solving the real needs and like the real problems rather than making a huge amount of assumptions and kind of not tackling the real problem? I suppose there's probably a different perspective, Rosie, maybe from that organizational perspective, and Mark maybe more widely looking at kind of like climate change, how you actually ensure that you're solving the right problems. Mark, do you want to kick us off on any thoughts around that?
Certainly. I think there are some golden rules for companies, particularly who are going into the sustainability space or want to be sustainable. And I love the fact you mentioned the peer-to-peer competition. I work for a company, I'm on their sustainability board, and strangely enough, they're competing with Microsoft. So when Microsoft said they're going carbon neutral by 2030, this company, Suprasteria, said it's 2028 for us, 2 years earlier. So that there is this incredible energy. But I think the most important thing, and this is my golden rule, is transparency. The reason being is because the public knows that actually going carbon neutral or going sustainable isn't overnight. So therefore, when you see on Google, it says at the bottom, carbon neutral since 2007, all of us just go, yeah, no. Okay, I mean, it doesn't have any resonance or backing to that. And so it is really about a journey. It's about companies going on a brand journey that's saying, look, we've started here. We're going to hold our hands up. Yes, we're not very sustainable. We're not very green. We have a huge emissions. We are then plotting with you, our customer or our people that we're engaged with, we're going on that journey. And I've seen this in many different companies. So, for example, Sky went carbon neutral actually in 2007 and did a fantastic job. Now what they're saying is, well, hang on, that was great, but now we want our suppliers to also be carbon neutral. So we're going to say, I'm sorry, in a few years' time, you will have to provide us with TV programs which are carbon neutral. And so therefore you're affecting the supply chain. And I think that's really powerful. It's about not just influencing your own organization, but going out and using your influence and basically contaminating, being that green virus and sort of like infecting all of your supply chain, or as Microsoft have said, their value chain. However, I have never worked out what a value chain is.
It's really interesting though, because we talk a lot around these topics, and often there's an ethical, obviously, or a sustainability element being in the for good world. And I think one of the things that I've seen come across quite strongly is organizations also fear talking about what they're doing well, in the fear of being accused for greenwashing or being highlighted that they're not doing something so well. And I think there's also like a bit of a media sometimes element to it, where people can be point fingers and say, you're not doing that though. And actually, I think this whole thing of being transparent, putting your hands up and saying, we're not perfect, but we're doing something towards being better, is also like a real shift and something that resonates a lot with certainly the conversations I've had, Mark, and it's really, really interesting to hear you say as well.
I also think that a lot of organizations and companies are deeply conservative with a small c because they don't want to be the first to put their head above the parapet. They don't want to be the first. If somebody else is doing it, oh yes, we have to catch up with that. And actually, I think what's interesting is when I've worked with organizations, is when you engage with people inside, there's always really passionate people that actually care about sustainability and their company or their organization and start to gently infect those people. And that actually slowly spreads. And actually, once you've got one foot over the sort of like doorstep, almost like, oh, we've announced this and nobody's shot us,
Yeah.
then it does start to accelerate. And I do think there are lots of really positive things, like the Carbon Disclosure Project gives awards. It basically says, you, company X, fantastic, here, have a AAA rating because you've done so well, and that basically gives a little bit of impetus and goes, well, hang on, this isn't so bad. We can do this.
Yeah. And again, with that social proofing, other organizations seeing people be rewarded and seeing more business and seeing consumers react well, it all encourages that good behavior. In terms of, Rosie, from a design perspective, working with organizations, is it a challenge to keep that kind of those real user needs at the heart of the process, or what's your experience around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's as Mark was saying, it's about having that kind of north star as an organization. Really, like what do you kind of stand for? What's your mission? Where are you kind of going as a brand or a business at the center? When it comes to the products and services, those should be an expression of that purpose. And actually, kind of, when a user engages with those, they should kind of be experiencing that kind of really big vision and north star. But I think it's it's definitely sometimes a challenge to kind of hang on to those kind of real user needs. It's very easy to kind of drift and think that actually the way that we see something is the way that it should be. Building out a feature or building out a kind of experience that we think is great might not necessarily be one that a consumer thinks is great. And the way to remove that, as I was saying, is through kind of design research and testing. And that will really, if you're kind of testing iteratively throughout a project and a process, that helps to remove assumptions. It enables empathy. It kind of really exposes any further problems that maybe haven't been kind of looked at previously. It also really can, for a designer or creative, provide kind of hooks that someone can think creatively through a problem in a different perspective and really make sure that a product or service lands in someone's lives. But yeah, in terms of creating those tools, there's lots of different ways that you can bring kind of users into an organization through kind of workshops and different deliverables and tools. It's really important that those are kind of front of mind. There's loads of different methods and processes that you can do to make sure that the consumer is kind of at the heart of developing a product or service.
Amazing. I am super conscious I can see questions flying in from everyone watching. So before we dive into those and we get you all engaged with those, it would be great for one example, if you've got it each, of examples of how you've seen or maybe used technology yourself being used in that way, maybe to close that gap between intention and action, or something that you feel would be really useful to highlight. Mark, do you want to kick us off? Just put you on the spot.
I was gonna let Rosie go first. I'm desperately trying to think of some technology.
Hey Rosie, go on, you go. Give Mark a few more minutes.
Had some great examples. One that I was just thinking, Mark was saying about kind of simplifying choice, actually just making it really easy for people. They don't have to do anything, they don't have to make a decision. And I was just thinking about Ecosia, the kind of web search platform. So for every search, they remove 1 kilogram of CO2. So I think that's just a really simple way, people don't have to think about what they're doing there. That is just kind of structured, simplifying choice, making it easy for people.
Cool. Mark, any great ideas popped into your head?
So no, I mean, one of the things that I think is, I'm like Rosie, I think it's about making things easy. So when you have a brand that you trust and that their products are carbon neutral or even carbon negative, I think that makes it much easier. So one of the brands that I sort of advise and are on their sustainability panel is Sheep Included. They are a new fashion brand which is carbon negative, and they basically show the whole process. I mean, you can even basically do your QR code on your jumper, which then shows you which sheep your jumper came from. So that incredible technology to say, look, we can even show you the farm, we can tell you about the sheep, we can tell you their name, sort of like all of that. And actually, you can wear your merino wool jumper with pride, sort of like, so that's how interesting technology and brand fit together. Now, how many of the actual customers actually bother to check the QR? I have no idea, but it's just
Yeah.
an interesting way of actually allowing that to happen. And it also means that you can have a way of tracking sustainability with particular items. And I think that is going to be something, because we are all wedded to our phone. So if we can wave our phone over a new product and go, yeah, not going to buy that. That's basically destroyed half of the Antarctic. Oh, that one. Ooh, that planted most of the rainforest. Oh, I'm having that one. So that's simplistic, but I think because we've become so used to using the phone as our go-to tool, any of the apps that we can use to help us make decisions that make us feel better and give us good products, I think will be really important.
Comes back to an earlier point, doesn't it, around transparency and giving people that access to that knowledge to then make a decision around their ethical decisions as well, which is really powerful, and helping people behave better, change those behaviors by providing them that information where they can really see that is quite interesting.
Giving them the education,
absolutely. Really, really interesting. Right, question time. So I think Greg and James are still here as well, and I'm hoping so, because the first question I've got is directed at you two. So, good to have you back on the screen. So Greg and James, where do you see the interplay and synergy of legislation, peer pressure, and personal education? So actually, I'm guessing that could be all of you, really. But Greg and James, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, we'll take an initial stab, definitely. So if we look at climate change and the UK specifically, 47% of the British public doesn't believe in individual action. So they believe that government and corporations should be the one that take the lead and take action. So I think there's a lot of work for us to do if like almost half of the UK population doesn't believe in that. So do you try and convince them to take personal action, or is there perhaps some other way to engage that public? I don't necessarily have the answer, but I think it's a combination of those factors there of legislation, peer pressure, and education to motivate the people that are already kind of like on board. There's half of the population that does believe in personal action, and you should probably empower those people to take those actions. And then there's another half there where, legislation and heavy hand of government probably has to play a role.
It's a really tough one. It's a bit of a chicken and egg thing where governments be afraid to pass like brave legislation onto people that they perceive as resisting that because they are ultimately, wanting to stay voted in. So yeah, it's a tough cycle to kind of break, but I think it's a combination of all those different layers working together.
Absolutely. And Rosie, you mentioned social proofing, peer pressure. Do you see one playing more of a role, or do you see legislation, peer pressure, and education kind of all needing to come together as the team are kind of saying there?
Yeah, I think it's like looking at those in harmony, and it's like they're all going to overlap. You need everything to kind of be in sync to make sure that it's truly effective, because one wouldn't work without the other.
Yeah, absolutely. It really does feel that way. Right.
I mean, I think that you have to be realistic.
Yeah.
If we're going to solve or we're going to deal with climate change, then it has to come from government. Okay?
Yeah.
So we all have to be realistic. So for example, if government decarbonized the whole of the electricity grid overnight, suddenly we wouldn't be feeling so guilty about using all our gadgets. So I think that's key. But then what people forget is individual behavior is incredibly powerful, because that is the message that is sent to government and to companies. So yeah, individually, we can't solve it. Even if we all got together individually and said, we're going to solve this, we can't. But actually, our voice, and people forget that, our voice is very powerful. Companies listen to consumers going, which direction are they going in? Let's follow the trend, etc. How can we get ahead of that wave? Same with government. They want to be able to actually deliver things. And it's also about messaging. There's so many positive win-wins out there that people forget. So for example, electric cars suddenly halves the air pollution in all of our cities, which is brilliant, because suddenly our health gets better, our children don't get as much asthma, etc. And that saves a huge amount of money on our healthcare costs. So I think it's that messaging that we're missing, that positive cycle of reinforcement that we need.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really powerful. Funnily enough, Mark, leads so perfectly into the next question. You guys are asking questions which really help segue. Everyone knows I love a segue.
Love a segue.
Love a segue. It's my thing. So what activities motivate individuals to pressure and support political change that supports the climate for migration efforts that are impactful? So I think that's a really interesting one to follow on from what we were talking about before. Mark, do you want to kick us off with that? I feel like you'd have some ideas around that.
So, I mean, for 30 years, climate scientists, myself, and many other activists have tried to scare the public into doing something different. And I think that is the wrong motivation. I think individuals are fully aware. They've watched David Attenborough, they've seen all the documentaries. Even the Daily Mail on the front page goes, climate change is real, this is bad. You know, like today, you can see California and Canada, 42 degrees Celsius, you know, we can see it all around us. So now we have to move that motivation to saying, hang on, well, what can we do? What's the positives? What things can actually improve things for the planet and improve things for your life? I mean, I give you an example, which is moving to a more vegetable-based diet or plant-based diet. Absolutely brilliant for your health and your family's health. Ooh, but it's also good for the planet. And so we need those sort of nudging to basically go, you really don't want that cheap, nasty processed meat. How do we gently move you to basically replacing that with sort of like plants, more vegetables, etc. But at the same time, if you really need to have that gorgeous steak or that Wagyu burger, yeah, you can still have it. You know, it's about trying to find that balance between shifting behavior to a more positive and healthier lifestyle, but keeping some of that joy in life and not feeling guilty about everything we do.
It's really interesting in terms of that like extreme versus like achievable and sustainable behavior change, because I think that's really interesting when I think about things I've even done, because I tend to be quite extreme, kind of an all or nothing. And actually often the kind of sustainable behavior is when you find that balance, as you're saying. So I think that's a really interesting point. In terms of the next one, Rosie, I think this is probably an area you might have some really great thoughts on. You know, what is the best way to engage participants in ethical fashion? So we mentioned kind of fashion towards the end. What are your thoughts around that, having worked with brands?
So is the question asking about how do we get people to kind of buy sustainable clothes, etc.?
Yeah, so in terms of ethical fashion, what's the best way to kind of engage consumers in shopping more ethically?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are some brands that are doing that really well, and it's about kind of normalizing it and talking about this is kind of the baseline where brands should be thinking sustainably and making it accessible to people. So we talked about kind of making the, Mark was talking earlier about choices and making it easy for people to kind of make those purchases. So I think that there's, on the one hand, making sure that it's, readily available for people to kind of purchase and buy products that are sustainable. And on the other hand, it's also kind of how do we rethink from the ground up? What are the, how can we create actual new and innovative products themselves? So there's like the way that we kind of sell and communicate and market and message, but there's also, the actual kind of materiality of a product itself.
And I think, it comes back to the kind of like that first question, doesn't it? In terms of that powerful three, that legislation, that kind of social proofing, peer pressure, and that kind of personal education. And I think that transparency that's come through from a lot of what we're talking about. And I think if you can find that sweet spot, get that all right.
I think brands like, you know, Patagonia, we were talking earlier about the sheep jumper, kind of made me think of Patagonia. You know, they don't get involved in kind of certain kind of sales or like Black Friday sales because they don't want to kind of perpetuate that type of behavior. So their, you know, their whole ethos as a brand is about products that will last the test of time, that will, you know, stand, you know, they, you know, or people can kind of resell or recycle or kind of reuse their products. So it's about from the ground up, they've made a decision, and we're talking, I guess this is a theme run throughout. As a business, they've made a stand to ensure that the products that they sell are going to have a positive impact.
I think again as well, it was that trust element, isn't it? I mean, honestly, I think I could stand here and ask you all questions all day. So I can't thank you enough for joining us, all of you, and kind of sharing your expertise and kind of helping us unpick that topic. And it's wonderful to hear such positivity in terms of how behavior change can be used for good and those kind of big topics and big problems that we can tackle. So thank you all for your time today and for joining us. It was great. So that's kind of it for us. Just one last thing to say is thank you everyone for joining us, and also just to highlight that our next Tech for Good talk will actually be on the future of fundraising. So a topic we're really passionate about here in terms of supporting charities and anyone trying to raise really valuable funds to be able to make real difference in people's lives and the kind of areas they support. That will be on the 20th of July. So hopefully you can join us. It'll be at 3 p.m. again. So thank you all for joining us, and hopefully see you then. Thanks, guys.
See you later.
Bye.